Um, Good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director of International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation in Washington, D.C. And I'm very pleased to be hosting and moderating today's discussion for the release of an Asia Foundation report titled Firm Partners in an Unstable Region: Prospects for Trilateral Cooperation Between the Republic of Korea, the United States, and Australia. In December, the Asia Foundation held a virtual meetings between Americans, Australians, and South Koreans who are all interested in each other's countries and their relations to discuss major security and economic and trade issues between important to all three countries. But they also addressed other areas where there could be enhanced cooperation, areas such as energy and critical minerals, among others. This report is available to you will be available to you in the link. And so I hope you'll take the time to download it and read it. I think also the release of the report comes at a good time with President Biden preparing to go to South Korea and then later on to Japan in just a couple of days. The Asia Foundation wishes to thank its partners in this project, the Australian government, particularly the Australia-Korea Foundation in Seoul, the Perth U.S. Asia Center, and at the University of Western Australia, and also the Friends of the Asia Foundation in Korea and the Korea Economic Institute of America. And I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Kwang Kim, and his associates, Ms. Kyun-Suk Lee and Ms. Kyung-Sung Lee, for their assistance throughout this project. We have three terrific speakers this morning, very knowledgeable about relations between all three countries. We have Representative Cho Jung-hoon, who is a member of the 21st National Assembly in Seoul. He sits on the Trade, Industry, Energy, SME, and Startups Committee, which is a lot of issues to cover in just one committee. He's a member of the Transition Korea Party, and he's also a co-founder of that party. They don't identify themselves as progressive or conservative, but looking at trying to find practical solutions to help address issues important in ordinary life to Koreans in Seoul and elsewhere throughout the country. He's no stranger to Washington, D.C. He worked for 15 years at the World Bank in a variety of capacities. Our second speaker will be Mr. Gordon Flake. He's the founding Chief Executive Officer of the Perth U.S. Asia Center and our Australian partner in this project, which is at the University of Western Australia. He too is no stranger to Washington. He's the former president of the Mike and Maureen Mansfield Center. And going way back, I guess we're dating ourselves, Gordon, you were the director of research for the Korea Economic Institute of America when you first came to DC. And then finally, last but not least, is Dr. Michael Green, who is Senior Vice President for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And last but not least, a trustee of the Asia Foundation's board. And he's also had a very illustrious career working in government, as well as Senior Director for National Security Affairs at the National Security Council under President George W. Bush. And so I've asked each of our speakers to speak for approximately 8 minutes each on their thoughts of the trilateral relations and how these relations can be enhanced moving on into the future. And so without further ado, let me turn over to Representative Cho, and thank you all again for participating in today's event. Representative Cho, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Just fine, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I this is a great honor and pleasure to join this session. And I have to acknowledge that while Dr. Flake and Dr. Brandon are the co-authors of this very well-written report, Firms Partners in an Unstable Region, I am, I guess, in filling the shoes of my dear friend and the director of the Asian Foundation of Seoul office, Dr. Kwang Kim. I had a good discussion with him before this session and went over the report. I guess I'm going to use my 8 minutes to reflect some of the potential challenges to realize this trilateral partnership. While we all acknowledge that there's a great potential benefits if we make it happen. As the title indicates, foreign partners, I think the report indicates that it is a good thing. It is worthwhile. It's a good objective to create a partnership with 3 countries. But sometimes the odd number friendships can make some friendship dynamics interesting. I have 2 daughters. They always tell me that even number friendships are better. Even for birthday, they invite 3 friends, 5 friends to make it even. So this is going to be a very interesting partnership that each respective country is going to pursue. And I think it is going to be important to realize unique perspective that each country faces while we pursue the same objective of this from partnership in a very unstable region. As I may represent Korea, let me bring you all to the perspective of Korea. As you may know, Korea locates in a peninsula, northeast, surrounded by China and Japan and Russia and North Korea, with a heavy influence of US. While we love peace more than anyone else, we believe we still remain as one of the last block of country still pay the price from the Cold War. Despite the fact that OECD and the international community called Korea as advanced economy as of last year, one of the first example who actually jumped from the developing country so-called into OECD since the Second World War. There's a still inherent fear due to the insecurity of the region, mainly from North Korea, but also increasingly from the increasing rivalry between China and US. While Korea speed up for economic development, we thought and considered international order, so to speak, is kind of fixed. However, there are very few people in Korea now than the world order will remain as it used to be, let's say 10 years back. Well, we don't really know what it may look like in 10 years time, but we are sure that it will be different from now. It has been changing very rapidly, and Korea, depending on the regime change, takes a rather different, sometimes conflicting positions in terms of weight between the US and China, to simplify. So it's going to be very interesting that the new administration, which got sworn in a few days ago, how the new administration is maneuvering this very delicate international relationship, especially the rivalry between China and Korea. My perspective, which tends to be, it is fair to say that many members of the National Assembly have a quite different perspective of how international strategy of Korea should be in the light of increasing balance of power conflict between China and US. The rivalry, the irony we face is that as we get closer to our number one alliance, which is US, the kind of pressure from the other side is proportionally increasing. So the situation we face is very different from that of Japan. While Japan, if I may, has a very straightforward and then explicit strategy, and I don't think they have no other alternative or any appetite for change. But Korea, sitting between China and being a front line of US, Japan-Korean alliance, has to pay quite dear price even for a subtle change of power in the region. So with that accumulating experience of subtlety, I think the policymakers in Seoul tends to move very conservatively. And with the regime change, after 5 years of Moon Jae-in administration, I think my expectation and other expert expectation is Korea is probably moving slightly, not slightly, but quite explicitly toward more traditional alliance strategy, which is with the US. But with the economic tie with China ever increasing, the situation is not so simple. And any slight deviation can cause great price in terms of our economic life. So in this delicate environment we face, there's an increasing recognition and awareness that this type of trilateral cooperation in the region is going to be very important. The old thinking that the main players that influence Korean Peninsula is only four, namely US, China, Russia, Japan, that old thinking is probably over. There's increasing recognition, awareness that we need to bring other Asian countries, including Australia. So I think the new administration is expected to expand its outreach to those countries. I had a chat with a new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Park Jin, a few days ago when there was an inauguration party of the new president, and he is one of the well-known experts of international relationship, probably well-known to Washington as well. He and I agree that I think we need to diversify a portfolio, so to speak, of our friendly countries. Doesn't mean that we need to diversify or deviate from our alliance with US, but this simplified four-player paradigm is no longer working. So in this context, I think Australia, which is in an old sense known as friendly, nice, good country, but with a little significance in terms of strategy to Korean Peninsula, can actually should play a quite interesting role in maintaining peace, to say the least, and also boosting economic prosperity of the region. And I hope and trust Australia also realized that maintaining the region stable and economically cooperative is also mutually beneficial to Australia as well. As you said, the President Biden is scheduled to arrive in Seoul tomorrow. It's going to have a summit between our new President Yoon Suk-yeol on Saturday. And there's a excitement, there's a hype. Quite unusual that President Biden visit Korea ahead of Japan. Normally it was Japan and Korea. That was the order. This time it changes. So some journalists said this is a significant meaning and blah blah blah. But there's an increasing also concern whether China will announce any retaliative actions. We still remember very vividly when Korea installed a THAAD missile in our country, China immediately launched a economic retaliatory action. So our companies who had a big operation in China, many of them had to shut down and paying dear price of that. So I think cautious move toward more stronger US alliance is going to be a trend, with expectation or kind of preparation of China kind of roughly protesting or not necessarily preventing, but exercising their muscles to make sure that our Korean Peninsula remain rather neutral to their perspective, rather than colored with US, Japan, Korea, and Australia alliance exclusively. One good example is IPEF. Korea has recently joined the IPEF treaty, and we watch very carefully how China will react, because our economy has two main pillars. Of course, one is with Japan and US, and to less extent, but certainly with Australia. Another pillar which we cannot ignore at all is China pillar, and how that pillar will play out. The Minister of Trade, who I spoke today actually, is actually very vigilant. What will happen immediately after hopefully successful summit of Korea and US over the weekend. So in kind of summarizing what I'm thinking, in principle, I don't think there will be anyone who oppose improving trilateral partnership between Korea, US, and Australia. And as the report indicates, there's many perspectives: security, economic, energy, technology, and sustainability, and many. But I think there's also increasing challenges. One being China. The second one, I don't think is challenge, but important consideration is the role of Japan. And with this triangle, where do we put Japan in? I think all three countries has a very significant security and bilateral relationship, economic relationship with Japan. So how do we have a coherent strategy with Japan while we form a trilateral partnership, certainly friendship, but sometimes when it comes to international strategy, friendship means very different thing to different countries. So I'll be very curious how US participants and Australian participants thinks the role of Japan while we try to enhance this trilateral partnership, these three countries.
Representative Cho, in the interest of time, maybe
yes,
just wrap up.
Yes, that was pretty much all that I wanted to say as my opening remark. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You've gotten us off to a good start. And so now let me turn the virtual room over to Gordon Flake. Gordon, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, John. And it was a great honor to work together with you and Kwang Kim and your Asia Foundation team in Seoul on this project. And I congratulate you on the release of the report. I really like the title, Firm Partners in an Unstable Region. There's very few things in the world that are firm today, and it's good for us to celebrate this. I'd also congratulate you on the timing. It's pretty heavy pull for the Asia Foundation Washington office to get the President of the United States to fly to Korea just shortly after the launch here. So well done. Also, you timed it just weeks after the Korean election and 2 days before the Australian election. So it really does put this in our framework. And despite all those moving parts, I think I would come back to the conclusion that you came to in the report itself about the firmness of these relations. Today, however, if this is a triangle, if this is a trilateral relationship, I thought, given the fact that I'm in Australia and I approach this as an Australian institution and from an Australian perspective, I would address mostly the weakest leg of that triangle. and that is Australia-Korea relations. The Australia-US alliance is firm, and it has been for a long time. Likewise, the Australia-Korea alliance is firm and has been for a long time, and both of them will be. The Australia-Korea relationship is good. Is better than it's ever been before. We had a presidential summit for the first time in 9 years last year. The relationship was upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership. The very fact that Australia was included in this trilateral is an indication of how good things are. But having said that, it still is the weakest of those three legs. And part of the reason is that neither Australia nor Korea historically have regarded the other as a strategic partner. They've been important partners, but we did at the Perth US Asia Center a report about 3 or 4 years ago as part of a series on India in the Indo-Pacific, Vietnam in the Indo-Pacific, Indonesia, Japan, et cetera, all looking at their Indo-Pacific strategies. And when we did one on Korea, it was clear that out of all the countries that we had profiled, Korea had the most nascent or underdeveloped Indo-Pacific strategy. There are some attempts to make a new Southern policy, extend to be a kind of a broad Indo-Pacific policy. And most importantly, it was quite clear that Korea did not view Australia at that point as a key part of its Indo-Pacific strategy. So the chapter that I wrote for that book was called Peers, Not Partners. And the idea is that both Korea and Australia do a really good job of managing up relationships with the United States and the EU, et cetera. We also do a really good job of managing down. We're very proactive in Southeast Asia, in aid programs around the world, but we hadn't quite figured out how to deal with a country that is functionally a peer. Different sized populations, but very similar economies, very similar in the world in terms of our roles, et cetera, both treaty allies of the United States. I would say happily, in the 2 years since I wrote that chapter, the world has turned upside down. And there have been 2 mega trends which have changed the perspective in Seoul, and they've changed the perspective in Canberra. On the Korean side, I think Koreans have woken up and seen how proactive Australia has been in the TPP, now the CPTPP. They've seen how proactive a leader Australia has been in the Quad. They've seen how Australia is now a member of this new security agreement in this region, AUKUS, the Australia-UK-US agreement. And I think for the average strategic thinker in Korea, they've just kind of woken up and said, wow, Australia is doing something, we need to be part of that. And more importantly, and I'm going to get back to this in a minute, as they've recognized Australia's role in critical materials and future batteries and hydrogen and a whole bunch of other future industries, they've recognized that Australia is in every way a strategic partner. And I think that was evidenced by the fact that even under the previous government, which wasn't as internationalist in its proclivities, they did upgrade the relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership, including the visit of President Moon to Canberra late last year. On the Australian side, there is a complementary trend that's driving things together. And that really has been the impact of economic coercion upon Australia. The Chinese economic coercive activities that Korea did feel, as Representative Zhou mentioned, under the Chinese, or from the Chinese during the THAAD experiences. The Australians have felt that very directly for nearly 2 years now. And what that means is the Australian public, more broadly, the business community, the government now recognize that diversify isn't just a mantra. It's something that has to be built into our strategy. And the truth is, if you look at future batteries, if you look at supply chains, if you look at critical materials, if you look at energy, and all of these sectors, there is no meaningful diversification strategy for Australia that does not involve Korea. And there really has been this remarkable confluence in the last year and a half, 2 years, where I think for the first time, Korea and Australia really regard themselves as strategic partners. And so I'm very, very bullish on the relationship and the strengthening of that weakened third leg. Let me just wrap up, because I don't want to take up too much time with the initial comments, by commenting on kind of current politics. We, in 2 days, will know whether or not the current Conservative government in Canberra is re-elected, or whether or not we will have a return of a Labor government in Canberra. We do know the outcomes in Seoul now, a more conservative government. I'm actually, one of the things I'm encouraged about is that regardless of election outcomes in democratic societies, just as the US alliance really has gone from 20 years ago being a partisan issue in Korea to being truly a nonpartisan issue. The same way in Australia, the US alliance and the role of the United States had been a partisan issue in the past. It is not a partisan issue today. In the ongoing campaign in Australia today, they are doing everything to make it clear that there is no daylight between the opposition party and then the government on anything to do with security and alliance issues. And I would say the same will apply for the Korea relationship with Australia. And so that gives me a great bit of optimism. As for the specifics, and I'll keep this really short, I've already mentioned the areas that we put out in the report, which I couldn't agree with more. It has been amazing to me, even during our lockdown, where people couldn't come here, the number of Korean investors who have come here looking for opportunities in hydrogen, in lithium, in future batteries, and critical materials. And so it seems like there's a direct POSCO flight here every other week here in Western Australia. So that's quite remarkable. I would note one thing where I agree with Representative Joe on, and which I'd like to hear Mike Green's comments as well, and that is one of the most encouraging things I've seen from the new government in Seoul is their outreach to Japan. Because given the importance of Japan to Australia in every one of the same issues I just discussed, and given the importance of Japan to the United States in every one of the issues we talked about in the report, right? I think there's no question that from the perspective of Washington or Canberra, the stronger Korea-Japan relationships are, the easier that trilateral relationship between Australia, Japan, and Korea will be, and the more meaningful our cooperation will be. The last thing I'll comment on is, Representative Joe mentioned this Indo-Pacific economic framework. Look, I think it's a good idea. I appreciate the ideas of principles. We hosted an event last week with a mutual friend of Mike and mine, Taro Kono Taro, who Mike hosted in Georgetown just a week before. And he was very blunt about the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Says, give it up. He said, join the TPP, do something real, right? And I actually tend to agree with that. So the one area I would really like to see Korea work more proactively with is working together with Australia and Japan and other countries in the region to get the United States to put together a real economic and investment strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And that, I think, would be fantastic. So I'll end my opening remarks there. Thanks.
Thank you, Gordon. You made in your comments, you talked about the recent election and inauguration of President Yoon and the upcoming elections in just a couple of days in Australia. And so, Mike, in your comments, I was hoping that maybe you might address what next steps do you think the Biden administration might take with these new administrations in Seoul and Canberra to strengthen trilateral cooperation. So the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it and agreed with Gordon and Jung-Hoon's comments earlier. And let me quickly answer John Brandon's question. I think that for President Biden, this trip is a real opportunity to consolidate not only our bilateral alliances, but relations among allies. You'll see that in the Quad. And although there won't be a trilateral US Japan Korea summit, which at one point the White House hoped for, President Biden's going to be encouraging a lot more trilateral US Japan Korea cooperation. And I think North Korea's increasing provocations will make that happen. You can always count on the North Koreans to help you out in times like this. And with Australia, as Gordon said, the Australian Labor Party has done everything it possibly can to not make foreign policy and defense a target for the coalition. And that's not just politics. agreeing vehemently with the government reflects also where the Australian public mood is. And Gordon would know better than I do for another month because I'm moving to Australia. But I think that bipartisanship is very, very strong. In the Korean case, we'll see. There has emerged since the progressives came into power with Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun in a growing bipartisanship around the alliance after some really bumpy periods that I was in the White House for with Roh Moo-hyun. But we managed, despite these bumpy transitions to an effective two-party system in Korea, to have, robust bipartisan support for the alliance. But we don't know what will happen to some of President Yoon's initiatives with the opposition controlling the National Assembly. And so I hope that bipartisanship can be sustained in Korea. And I think President Biden will be reaching out on this trip to both parties to try to encourage that. If I could say something about the geopolitics of this trilateral US-Korea-Australia relationship for a minute, and then a little bit more about the agenda in the Indo-Pacific. On the geopolitics, I think what you're seeing is a growing recognition in the US, in Korea and in Australia, that Asia is not a bipolar US-China world. And each of the three countries took a little bit of a while to get to that recognition. For example, in the United States, in 2012, in Chicago Council of Global Affairs polling, a plurality of Americans said the best way to deal with the rise of China is to strengthen cooperation with China, even if it hurts relations with allies like Japan, Korea, and Australia. Plurality said China. So basically the public, and at the time, much of the Obama administration endorsed this kind of bipolar US-China future for Asia. How do we work out that relationship? But in recent polling in the Chicago Council, well over 2/3 of Americans say the best way to deal with China is strengthening our alliances and partnerships, even if China doesn't like it. And in Australia, as Gordon will remember, 10 years ago, the China choice argument by Hugh White and others, the idea that Asia was moving towards a bipolar US-China confrontation or relationship, and Australia had to manage that. I think that is now largely not gone, but is a minority view. And the majority view in government and academia in Australia is going to be able to shape the environment because it is multipolar, because Australia can build relationships with Korea, with Japan, with Indonesia, and the middle powers, not just the great powers, will shape the dynamic. I would argue Korea is the last of the three to kind of come to this realization. When Park Geun-hye was president, the Waegyobu Foreign Ministry documents were largely premised on a bipolar Asia. And much of what you hear in Seoul is how does Korea manage its interests between the US and China. But what I think you see with the new Yoon government and with people like Park Jin and Kim Sung-han and Kim Tae-hyo is a strategic appreciation that this is not a purely bipolar region, it's multipolar, and Korea can shape that environment and advance its interests by building strong partnerships the way Gordon described with other middle powers, and eventually one hopes with Japan. And that's a departure from the stance of the Moon Jae-in government, where the idea of strategic ambiguity, staying very passive so as not to get pulled into a bipolar US-China confrontation, that was the dominant thinking in Seoul. And as a result, the Korean government was completely self-isolating itself from all the diplomacy in the region. And my colleague Victor Cha at CSIS had a chart on his website, I think it's still on, showing lines between all the middle powers and major powers in Asia for new security and diplomatic initiatives over the last 5 years. And Korea is isolated. There are big, thick lines, lots of them, connecting Japan, Australia, India, Southeast Asia. And Korea was not there. So Korea was largely, in my view, denying itself the ability to really shape the regional order. And that is now changing. I think the Yoon government is going to be trying to be more of a regional and a global actor and less passive in these areas, which is in US interests. What does that look like? Well, one thing that made it difficult for Korean colleagues to embrace this idea of the Indo-Pacific was the worry about confronting China and getting caught in a bipolar competition with China. And I think in many ways, Australia has shown Korea and the United States the answer to that dilemma, which is don't do things in Asia against China, do things in Asia for Asia. And in the White House Indo-Pacific strategy, you'll see the word resilience, that the US is going to invest with allies and partners in resilience in Southeast Asia and South Asia. That concept of resilience is from Australia. And based on a full recognition that in Southeast Asia, countries don't want to choose, don't want to get pulled into this competition, don't want to be told don't work with China. And so the United States, Korea, Australia, Japan, the EU will gain the upper hand by not being against China, but by being the best partners we can be to help countries, particularly in Southeast Asia and now the Pacific Islands, be more resilient. And Korea brings an incredible toolkit to that task, really, really strong toolkit. So for example, KOICA does actually far more than JICA or Japan on women's empowerment. And so does DFAT in Australia. So there are really strong potential partnerships on women's empowerment and civil society building in Southeast Asia or the Pacific Islands. Korea brings real capabilities for infrastructure development, infrastructure financing. Right now, the US and Japan and Australia cooperate trilaterally on this. Korea would be an excellent partner, maybe initially with the US and Australia, and hopefully eventually with Japan as well, in providing high quality infrastructure financing. Not to drive out China's Belt and Road, but to force the Chinese side to play by global standards for transparency and accountability. Capacity building. The United States and Australia provide significant support to Vietnam, to the Philippines for their maritime domain awareness for patrol craft. So does Korea. But Korea does it completely bilaterally based on commercial sales, not in coordination with the US or Australia. If we coordinated our efforts better, we would be far more effective. So there are all these areas where we can be for Asia and investing in Asia and Asian resilience that are not a threat to China unless China intends to coerce these countries. But it's really about helping countries help themselves. It's a great agenda, and Korea brings a toolkit. Two more quick things. The defense relationship between Korea and Australia has enormous potential. A few years ago, I went to Seoul and with a delegation, and we went to meet the commander of the US Forces Korea, and he brought out his top generals to brief us. And the briefing the intelligence briefing we received from the Combined Forces Command was by an Australian Royal Air Force officer. Australia is integrated into our command and control on the Korean Peninsula. And later I traveled to Honolulu, and I had meetings with the combatant, the commander, and with the commander of U.S. Army Pacific, PAC Fleet, and so forth. When we met with the commander of U.S. Army Pacific, one of his two deputies was an Australian Major General, Army, whose job for the U.S. Army Pacific was partnership building with other allies, including Korea. So the only joint and combined command we have in the Indo-Pacific is with Korea, but the integration of Australia into our defense organizations is significant. And so there's a lot of possibility for defense cooperation. And then the last thing I'd say is one thing Korea and Australia have in common, and for that matter, Japan and Canada and other US allies and partners, is in the Korean and in the Australian foreign policy, it is very explicit that both governments seek a long-term productive relationship with China and an economic relationship with China. If you read the US Indo-Pacific strategy or any document out of this administration or the Trump administration, there is no mention of what a future US economic relationship with China looks like. So I've been in a lot of trilaterals in my career. I was in the first US Korea-Japan defense trilateral. I was in the first US Australia-Japan trilateral, in the first meeting of the Quad. As Representative Cho said, trilateral dynamics are interesting. But what I saw in government was usually it's the other two countries ganging up on the US. And if Korea and Australia come together on the US, they're going to be telling us, you have to explain what your long-term plan is for living with China. What is the economic relationship going to look like? Because we need one, and we think you do too. So I think it's a very positive source of pressure actually on the US. to have Australia and Korea working together in the room, helping us answer questions we haven't yet answered. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Mike. For those of you in the audience that would like to pose a question, I encourage you to pose your question in the Q&A box on your screen, and then we'll take them accordingly. But let me just pose a question to all three of you. The report, one of the report's recommendations was to pursue functional multilateralism. We've talked a bit about this, expanded to countries outside the ROK-US Australia Trilateral, and to promote task-oriented cooperation. This report lists a multiple of priority areas like cybersecurity, space cooperation, artificial intelligence, energy security, clean energy, among others. If you had to pick one or two areas to focus on for this functional multilateralism, what might they be? And so why don't we start with you, Representative Cho.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed actually the comments from the two colleagues, Dr. Brandon and Dr. Mike Green. If I have to, it's a difficult question to pick one. But
well, I mean, they were all important, right? I mean, they were all mentioned. I would just that maybe if people were to sort of say, let's put a particular emphasis on this from the get-go. If you thought of one or two, what would
from the Korean perspective, my pick would be economic and trade cooperation, especially in the face of the conflict in the Ukraine region. I actually don't know quite well about the economic situations in Australia due to the conflict in Ukraine, but in Korea, we are facing a real threat of inflation, and not just inflation, but also the shortages of critical items for daily lives, including oils, flours, and some critical fishes that we need to make our fish cake available. Every week there's item by item that is basically being sanctioned or being allocated by the authorities because we have shortages of items. Increasing number of countries start to ban the export of their agricultural products. So our Ministry of Trade is now crazy about securing the alternative imports destinations. So I assume if we can make some trade agreement to provide reliable, to have a reliable supply and purchase agreement in terms of key agricultural products and some mineral products, I think it will make Korea strongly and keenly realize the importance of the potential benefit of this trilateral relationship. As Dr. Flake mentioned, I think Korea is the least, is kind of newcomer to this trilateral relationship, and it's going to be very important to make one good example. What do we get? What would we get if we make this bilateral relationship, trilateral relationship between Korea, Australia, and Korea, Australia, US better? And the most keen pain we face at the moment is trade.
Thank you. Gordon, your thoughts?
Thanks. I'm going to agree with Representative Cho. I actually think, looking at this from an Australian perspective, the most important area is trade. I mean, the United States has made great strides in recovering its reputation in security. It's made great strides in recovering and repairing its reputation in diplomacy and lots of other areas in terms of multilateral cooperation, coordination with allies, US, NATO, et cetera. It is quite easy to say in the diplomatic and the security sphere that the US is back. You can't say that on trade and economic issues. Again, the fact that we're still awaiting any type of substantive around a vague Indo-Pacific economic framework almost a year and a half into the administration, that there hasn't been, the digital alternative that we were promised, and there's been no movement of it. And I'll give you some context. Early last week, we hosted the Labor Shadow Minister for Trade and Shadow Minister for Resources, Madeleine King, former colleague of mine, and she gave an impassioned speech called North by Northwest, Australia's Export Future. And it was a full-throated defense of multilateralism and free trade. And it came from Australia's Progressive Party, right? It came from the left. It came from Labor. It didn't come from the Conservative Party, right? And so if Korea can agree with that, and Australia can agree with that, and the United States can't even mention the word trade, right? It clearly is an area where there needs to be multilateral coordination on that issue. The second area, if I can choose one more, is on critical materials, and it's not yet multilateral, and it needs to be made multilateral. I think Korea, Japan, the United States, EU, we've all now recognized that on the full spectrum of rare earths and critical materials, we have a problem. At present, there's only a single commercial scale rare earths processing facility in the entire world outside of China, and that's an Australian firm invested in by Japan in Malaysia, right? And that only does with certain rare earths, right? And we now, over 2 years, we did a major report on it. We've done major conferences on it. People are starting to get the idea that you have to pay attention. But the more we look at it, the more complicated it becomes. Because for any product, defense, commercial, technology, communications whatsoever, that require rare earths, and the full spectrum require them, there are multiple stages. And Australia as a country may have the mines and the resources, but we don't have the processing capability. And we don't have the second, third, fourth, fifth stages. And certainly Japan and Korea have the end, battery, cathode, that level of processing, but we don't have the middle sections. And everybody now recognizes that there is an inherent risk to the entire global economy, that all of our supply chains in this full spectrum all rely on China. But once you begin to pick at it, you might be able to take one stage of it out of China and do it in South Korea. But that same product that you did a stage of processing in Korea or Australia would still have to go into China for 3, 4, and 5. And so it just seems to me that if we're really serious about diversifying supply chains, if we're really serious about making sure that we have choice in the world, that it has to be multilateral in its nation, that we've got to involve the UK, Germany, the EU more broadly, we've got to involve Japan and Korea and Australia and the United States. And as of yet, that's not happening. But given the leadership role that Korea has already played on this and Australia's keen interest on it in the United States, that's an area where I think they could be important leaders in the multilateralization of an issue, which is still, even 2 years after a crisis, a decade after what happened with Japan, still just kind of bumping around in a conceptual framework.
Thank you. Mike?
Well, I agree. I think trade is the area where Korea and Australia will likely align the most for all the reasons that Gordon and Jung-Hoon said. The thing about supply chains, in Korea, President Biden is going to give a speech, and I'm told one of the major themes will be supply chain security and technology, and he'll really encourage Samsung and SK and others to invest in the U.S. But especially for the U.S. and Korea and other like-minded allies to coordinate better our technology competition policies. That's going to be a really important theme. Supply chain problems are not something that the governments can just fix. Firms are going to make their own decisions. And honestly, governments, unless they disrupt supply chains, can only change those at the margins. But there is one area where the US and Korea in particular will play a leadership role, and that's semiconductors. And the most important high-end semiconductor fabrication countries or economies are Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the US. But the reason it is so important to the US is not just supply chains, it's the very high-end semiconductors that are necessary to do the computations for artificial intelligence. And right now, the Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology and other experts figure that the US, Korea, in particular Taiwan, and Japan have a 15-year lead over China on the high-end semiconductors you need to really power artificial intelligence. So it's going to be really critical for the US and Korea to align on that. And you might wonder, what is Australia's role? Well, there are three things that are going to be really important for AI, and one of them is quantum. And Australia, and in particular the University of Sydney, where I'll be heading, are very strong on quantum. So that overall AI basket, it seems to me, an innovation and technology is a particularly ripe area for the US and Korea and others. I wouldn't call it multilateral, I'd call it plurilateral. As Gordon suggested, it's Holland. The Dutch are very good on semiconductor fabrication. The British, the Australians, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, if you can find a way to do it as an economy, not a state. And Korea is going to be right at the center of it, and Australia is going to have an important role. And for Australia, it's both the quantum capabilities, but also Britain and Australia are right there with the United States on the national security dimensions of technology. So in terms of framing the policy, Australia is going to be very influential. So that'll be a key area. But Gordon's right about IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's not going to be very impressive. It's better than nothing, but it's not going to be impressive. And I went on these trips with President Bush for almost 5 years. And when you're in Washington negotiating these things, it's horrible if you're in the foreign policy business, because the domestic constituents sort of dominate. And right now, US Trade Representative's office is very protectionist, frankly, and very hostile to anything that might lead on a path to TPP. So they're really obstructing a substantive dimension to IPEF. They don't want market access in the US. They don't want negotiations. And so what happens is that's the position the president's given. The debate in Washington is not resolved. He goes out and then he talks to Ewan and he talks to Kishida and he talks to Albanese or Morrison, whoever wins. And then if all of our friends and allies are saying, we love you, but this is just not credible, that will really impact the US debate. So, coordinating the strategy on trade between Seoul and Canberra is going to be a big part of helping the US get to the right place, frankly.
Thank you. Let me pose, there is someone who has posed a question. Emmett Shanlett Avery at the Congressional Research Service says, we pound on Japan and the ROK to mend their relationship. And while there is promise under new leadership, some of the issues remain intractable. Can Yoon regionalize South Korean foreign policy without resolving issues with Japan? Is the US ROK-Australia Trilateral an alternative to engaging with the Quad if Tokyo and Seoul can't work things out? Why don't I ask Representative Cho to, let me ask Mike to go first. So I know you have a hard stop at 10 o'clock and that's 6 minutes. And then we'll ask Representative Cho. So, and Gordon, if you have anything to add, that would be fine. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, Emma's onto something. There's a reason that the Asia Foundation, CSIS, and others are, having all these trilateral US, Australia, Korea efforts bloom right now, and why Moon Jae-in had such a successful high-profile trip to Australia, and that is regionalizing Korea's foreign policy is politically easier with Australia than Japan, but conceptually, it moves Korean thinking in the same direction. So Australia is like a, same great taste, less filling version of talking to Japan about these issues. But ultimately, without a Japan-Korea leg, this broader plurilateral effort to invest in a free and open Indo-Pacific is not going to work. And both Tokyo and Seoul are moving in the right direction now. But and I'm sure Gordon has seen this. My sense is that the Yoon government is too optimistic about what can be done with Japan, and the Kishida government is too pessimistic about what can be done with Korea. There's an election in Japan. But what I hear from Japanese political leaders is, well, we got to see what happens in the National Assembly, all these reasons for caution. And what I hear from friends in the new Blue House is, a real excitement that they're turning the page with Japan and not recognizing how much the Japanese side thinks that Korea has to resolve these court case issues. So, I think President Biden would be wise to quietly encourage, more proactive thinking. But if he does it very publicly, it's going to backfire. So we'll see the results, and we'll know them when we see them.
Thanks, Mike. Representative Cho?
Christian, yes, I think the question actually nail the most important challenges we face. I think it is somehow expectable that some good news may come out from the bilateral summit between Korea and US this weekend. But we have no idea when the bilateral summit between Korea and Japan may take place, and what will be the outcome of it at all. So it's a lot high risk and uncertain area, without which, as Mike mentioned, the full realization of trilateral partnership can sustain. It is actually quite accurate that there's a somehow hype in Seoul that with our good intention, this spicy bilateral relationship between Japan and Korea can improve quickly. I'm doubtful about it. When I met diplomatic friends in Korea, and I have many friends in the National Assembly of Japan in Tokyo, and I have friendship with relatively younger generation of members of National Assembly in Japan, and they are very skeptical whether anything can happen in short period of time. When I say short, it's a year or two. But as you all may agree, that it's not a good thing to speed up too fast to revitalize the Japan-Korea relationship, given the history we have. So I think it is always helpful to have a boost, to have a tailwind, to make some compromise from both sides, because we need that. At the same time, understand that it's a very delicate relationship, as all neighboring country conflict has been in the history of the world. And take one baby step at a time, and then get some applause around the world so that we can keep going, and finally shaking hands between two leaders. My best prediction is going to be about a year time after the result of Japan election becomes clear, and the supporting rate of President Yoon is somehow uncertain at the moment. As you probably know, he started very low rating of support right after the election. It's now going up. They call it super weak. And I don't know whether it will hit the average even. So it depends on the kind of supporting rate he will gain within 3 to 6 months period. But Japan is, I wish we have the participants from Japan, even though they are not one of the authors, to see how they view this kind of possibility of trilateral relationship.
Oh, Gordon, would you like to?
Just a very brief comment. I'm in the unusual position of being slightly more optimistic, and probably to my discredit, because I have I've been burned so many times over the last 30 years on the Korea-Japan relationship. But there's two things that make me a little bit more optimistic. One is I do think we're facing a very different geopolitical environment. And so the events in Ukraine, what's going on today in China in terms of their COVID response, and the increasing challenges in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, really are helping make it increasingly clear that what Japan and Korea have in common is far greater than what they have apart, right? And so the international environment, I think, is quite different on that front. And then I'm optimistic about the potential of these trilateral and other minilaterals to kind of encourage such cooperation. So again, the Japanese are already on the record on calling for AUKUS to become JAUKUS. Koreans could call for it to be caucus. Neither will happen, but it could be AUKUS plus cooperation with Japan, AUKUS plus cooperation with Korea. Already, as we mentioned several times on this call, I think there's a tremendous potential for Australia to bring Korea in, to the TPP. So Australia very, very openly lobbied for Korea to join the TPP, where, had it been Japan calling for it, it would have been a totally different answer, right? And so Australia has a very unique role to give voice to some of the same things that the US will or Japan will, but it will be interpreted differently in Korea. And as Mike indicated, I think that bears the potential of by regionalizing it, making it less sensitive. And so as Korea then develops an Indo-Pacific strategy, or develops a critical material strategy, or develops a supply chain strategy, they can do none of it without Japan. They can't do it, right? And Australia recognizes that, US recognizes that, India recognizes that. And the fact that that is a fact means that I think it is a different environment that will help Korea in that front. So I'll end up there.
Well, I think this is a good place to stop. This was a very rich discussion. I know Mike had to jump off a couple of minutes ago, and I wish to thank him for participating, but also you, Representative Cho and Gordon, thank you very much. This was as I said, a discussion that was held back in December. We didn't look at this as a one-off. We looked at this as that discussion and the report that you have now to sort of set the stage on how to delve deeper into topics to strengthen and deepen trilateral relations between South Korea, Australia, and the United States. And so with that, I'd like to thank the audience for their attendance in Seoul and in Perth. I know it's late, so thank you very much for joining us in your evening. And finally, I'd just like to thank my colleague, Shirley Keating, who has been instrumental in the success of this program and for helping with this webinar this morning or this evening, depending on where you sit. So thank you all. We look forward to seeing you again and on this issue and others. Thank you, Gordon. Thanks, Representative Cho.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a good night. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.